Hi, everyone, and hope you're having a warmer day than the one I'm having at the latitude that I live, 53 North 30. Anyways, I'm Lesley Francis, and today I'm going to talk about the cross of matter. And for some reason, Mercury is doing its retrograde thing, and I can't get my slides to move. Okay. Oh, now I'm too far ahead. All right. Okay, so the focus and the intent of this webinar is to explore the use of the four angles as a primary experience and expression of how we are grounded in our lives and how we're connected to the physical world. Essentially, I view them as our platform. So we're going to begin at the beginning, which is always a good place to start, right? So whether using a computer, or creating an astrological chart by hand, which I have done, there are the magic moments when you wait to see how the energies of that particular day take form, how they come together so you can see not just the energies that are, because if you look at an ephemeris, you can see the energies of the day, but until you have time and place, there's no actual physical vessel to put them in. So, and of course, I was just talking about that. So time and place determine the form. Together, they anchor us on Earth, creating the structure and the backbone of our lives through the four angles, which in turn define our physical world and our interaction with it, the cross of matter. So in the complexity of all these moving parts that we're so familiar with, it's easy to overlook how fundamentally important the angles are. And not just the ascendant and the midheaven, which are the two angles that we probably pay the most attention to, but the descendant and the IC. Each is part of a whole, and they can't function without each other, obviously. It's just that sometimes we forget that. So this actually has its roots in the history of astrology. So we're going to go over a little bit of the historical background. The concept of the four angles was actually developed first. Charts were constructed and used with the angles alone. I'm citing Chris Brennan's book, Holistic Hellenistic Astrology. And I quote, "The angles are the only places that have symbolic connotations independent of other schematic factors. And as a result of this, they act as the foundation for the meanings of the other places." And of course, we know that time and place ground us in the physical reality, and as a consequence, give us the form and the places and spaces where we can express the energies that we were born with. So just how I see the angles. They're seen in many ways: points of initiation, points of action, and points of urgency. Thresholds, shifts, turning points, doors, or as a set of two axes, ascendant, descendant, midheaven, IC, just not as a whole system. So today's view. So traditionally, and I mean that, and I'm looking mostly at the last 400 years. I don't know where that came. I'm not sure it was 400 years. I meant to say 100. Anyway, traditionally the focus is on the ascendant and the midheaven, while often overlooking the IC and the descendant unless there are planets conjunct them. This is a fragmented approach, rather like looking at two of the corners of your house's foundation. Here. So we want to deepen our approach. So the reality is all four angles are our anchor and our platform simultaneously. The rest of our chart rests on them, is defined by them, and illuminated by them. The signs on them, the planets ruling them, the interactions between them all tell the story of the personal framework we live within. I see them as windows on the world, the lens through which we experience the physical, because they define how and when and perhaps even why we incarnated. For me, the planets are energy, signs or expression, Houses are the stage and the angles are the foundation platform. So how do we use the cross of matter? Well, here's a number of questions that pertain to that, how to use the cross of matter. So what does your cross of matter say about you? How strong is your foundation? Are you grounded in the physical world? How do you see the physical world? How do you connect to it? Do you feel supported by the world you live in? In other words, is your contact with the physical world something that supports your long-term, who you are, where you're going, and what you're doing? Or is it a challenge to you to express the basic energies that you were born with in a constructive and what's the word I'm looking for? I wanted to say happy, but satisfactory way. So basic guidelines. Consider the angles separate from the houses connected to them. This is very important because when we're talking about your foundation, we're not, and your platform, we're not talking about the activities of each particular house. We're just talking about how you're grounded on the planet. Remember, we're examining the cross of matter as a whole, not individually, so we can see how they create the essential framework from which we experience life. And, often, let's face it, astrology is probably the most complex symbolic language that there is, at least that's my opinion. And so, there's always so much rich material. And I personally am always looking for something, shifting my perspective to see what more I can gather from defining what my life's purpose is and what the life's purpose is of my clients. So aspect to the angles as well as the planets that rule them are important. So please keep your orbs tight, because obviously the farther that the planet gets away from the angle, the more likely it is to be engaged in the activities of that particular house, as opposed to necessarily impacting the basic framework of your life. Okay, so we're just going to go through a little bit of an exercise here I called building the picture. So to really get a sense of what this feels like and to help you delineate it later, draw the cross of matter in your own chart freehand. Just the angles themselves with the sign on each one and nothing else. Don't use any degrees. That's not important at this point. The signs are the essential framework. After all, they cannot tell the whole story. That comes as we go through this process. So note the elements and the modalities involved. So do you have a mixed cross? Is it all one element? Is it all one modality? Is the picture they paint fluid, fixed, or adaptable, or again, or a mixture of both, or all three? Sorry about that. Well, you can't have all three. No, that's not exactly true. No, okay, now I'm sidetracking myself. My apologies. Mercury stationed to go retrograde conjunct my sun, so it's been a ride. So anyways, now I want you to draw another cross of matter. Now I know it might seem simpler to just add to the one that you've already drawn, but there is a purpose to this. In drawing it again, it allows you to see the things I'm talking about independently before you bring them together. Add in just a planet that rules each angle. Again, no degrees and no signs. This might seem overly simplified. Again, breaking it down into basic steps is so you can see how this picture is built, absorb it, and see what insight it offers. Step 3, so draw another cross of matter with the signs and the planets that rule those signs. And examine the condition of each ruling planet. What sign is it in? Is it dignified, exalted, in detriment, or in full? Is it direct or retrograde? Now, one of the wonderful things about astrology is you're always learning something new. And when I was looking at mine today, I realized that 3 of the 4 angles in my chart are ruled by retrograde planets, which I had never noticed before. Step 4, now add the degrees of the angles and the degrees of the ruling planets. Are the ascendant and descendant angles in aspect to the midheaven IC angles, or do they operate separately? In other words, are they directly connected to each other without the involvement of their ruling planets? So are you going to find that all those aspects of that cross actually are speaking to each other, communicating with each other? Because after all, we know that that's what aspects are about, are the lines of communication open? Step 5, examine the relationship between the rulers of all the angles. Now we're starting to get a little more complex. Initially, break it down into the 2 axes. Are the ruling planets in the axes aspecting each other? If so, how? Are they compatible by element or modality? Repeat the process by looking at all the rulers of the angles and their interactions with the angles and each other. So once you initially break it down into the 2 axes, then you move forward and have a look at, is the rule of the midheaven talking to the rule, is the midheaven talking to the ascendant, etc. Because of course, if that's true, then of course the descendant and the IC will also be in a relationship with each other. We already know that the ascendant, descendant are opposite each other, so they already have an interaction, and the midheaven IC the same. But when we're talking about the rulers, that starts to add another layer of complexity to what you're looking at. So then you're looking at the rulers. I kind of backtracked a bit there, so my apologies. So here we are, we're looking at the rulers and how they connect to each other, because then that strengthens the picture. And if, for instance, the angles don't aspect each other, but if the rulers do, then there's a stronger sense of communication and a better opportunity to actually, feel that connection you have to your physical world. And I know it seems odd for me to say that, because people are going to say, well, this is your cross of matter, you must have a relationship with the physical world. Well, not necessarily. I've had clients, and I've done this workshop before and looked at a chart in which the person really did not feel comfortable in the physical reality at all. Step 6, now add any planets that aspect the angles or the rulers of the angles. And now you can begin, obviously, to include degrees. Again, keep the orb tight unless it's the sun or moon. And even then, so when I say tight, I'm talking 2, maybe 3 degrees. If we're talking about the sun and the moon, and we're talking about the angles of the chart, I wouldn't go more than 5 or 6. If there are planets in the same sign as the angle, but not within spitting distance of the angle, they affect the house more than the angle. Consider conjunctions, oppositions, and squares first, because they are the more dynamic aspects. Although one could argue that quincunxes are also dynamic, and so are trines and sextiles, just different in different ways. Quincunxes are dynamic in the sense that they tend to knock you off balance, whereas the conjunction, opposition, and square allow for they're challenging, but they still offer a pathway that doesn't make you feel like someone is going to come along and knock you out of the room into the next room. As a whole, So, does the cross of matter support or contradict other factors in the birth chart? Does it act cohesively or is it fragmented? The key to this is the ruling planets and their relationship with each other. Just remember, adding the house placements for the rulers is not vital in understanding how you are connected to your physical reality. That may seem counterintuitive, but at this point in time, you're just looking at what's your relationship to your physical world. How does your platform or your foundation work for you? So the house placement may offer some further insight, but in understanding the basics of it, it's not really necessary. So this is the birth chart connected to the example I just outlined, and it's my chart. With a stellium and Aquarius, looking at this really helped me understand a little bit more about my relationship with physical reality. Because often if you have a stellium and Aquarius, you don't have depending on the day and the hour, you don't always have, you have a lot of connection to what's going on in your brain, but not necessarily your physical reality. And I was going to say something about that, but it went away somewhere. We'll just move on. As you can see, my picture is somewhat complex. And however, well, what I discovered in looking at this is what I wanted to say is that my midheaven IC, we have a Venus-Mars trine. So the IC midheaven is often an easier reality for me to deal with than obviously self versus relationships. Okay, sample charts. So in examining the first chart, we will go briefly through the steps while we only hit the highlights of the remaining charts. I will not be providing the birth data for these charts simply because they belong to my clients and they give me permission to use their birth charts in my workshops and webinars, but not to give out their birth data. And with a Moon Pluto opposition that I have, I totally understand that and respect that. So, not sure how much you can see of this, but we're just looking at the basic structure for Elizabeth. And so, so it's obvious that the opposite of 12 Virgo is 12 Pisces, but, and it's interesting because I could not create a wheel that just had the signs on it without the degrees. So this doesn't follow the process I set out. So sometimes technology and I don't get along very well because I'm not patient enough to constantly search for what I'm looking for. So her cross of matter is the 4 immutable signs. So what do we have there? We have adaptability. So Virgo ascendant, Sag IC, Pisces descendant, Gemini midheaven, ruled by Mercury. And I have in brackets Chiron because I think Chiron is really powerfully important in the sign of Virgo. Jupiter, as well as Jupiter, Neptune, which is the 7th, and then Mercury. So that's also, again, an extremely fluid expression of the energy because Mercury and Jupiter are always in some form of motion, and Neptune as well. So it reinforces the adaptability component. So now we're going to break it down a little bit more. So here we are. We're looking at the ascendant. You have the degree. The ruler is Mercury. It's a 29 Leo. It's peregrine and void, of course, but it's a mutual reception with the sun. So that mitigates some of that and allows for a little bit more connection. The IC, ruled by Jupiter. And again, we have a planet in late degrees, and it's in detriment. Granted, and here's a case of what I was talking about. It's in the same sign as the midheaven, but it's not conjuncted. The descendant, rulers Jupiter and Neptune's in Scorpio, and it's peregrine. Now, of course, it makes some lovely aspects to the Uranus, Sun, Pluto conjunction in the first house, which of course they're all within spitting distance of that ascendant. So, but again, these energies are not necessarily particularly grounded. Midheaven, ruler Mercury. So the cross of matter forms a mutable grand square. And so we begin to see a picture evolving. And then I go through the aspects. Mercury sextile Jupiter, but it's separating Chiron in a Y square to Jupiter. And again, Mercury's, and then that's separating. And then we look at Chiron's conjunct the descendant. You can see that's kind of in the corner. Oppose the ascendant, square the midheaven IC, and it's trine Neptune. So whether you view it as an asteroid or whatever you viewed it, because it's a bit of a maverick, in this particular chart, it has a lot of power. Although if you consider Chiron connected very strongly to Virgo as I do, then you would say that it's not in it's in detriment. Okay, planets in aspect to all the angles or rulers of the angles: Uranus, the Sun, Pluto conjunct the ascendant, and you can see the rest on the screen. It's a really complex picture. However, this is someone who does not have a lot of fixed energy. And okay, so the notes: complex relationship with her external world, in which she floats back and forth between optimism and fear, because we have Saturn over there beside Chiron. Mercury sextile Jupiter, separating, both void of course, ruling all four angles versus the dynamic oppositions across the ascendant-descendant axis. So she's often tuned out of her physical reality and an idealist with a strong pragmatic streak. So definite cohesiveness between the message of the angles and the rest of the chart. So from a perspective of looking at what this is very dynamic. There's, and just to give you an example, she's a social worker, and she got her master's degree, and she does a lot of work in the childcare system, trying to protect children who need protection. And she's always coming up with solutions that are way outside the box. And that's where all that adaptability and that fluidity comes in handy. However, in her personal life, it doesn't work out quite the same way. Career is often easier for her than her personal life. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Lily, and we're going to go through that really better management. How can you tell that all this Aquarius energy is making my brain not work in anything remotely looking like a consecutive order? Okay, so her cross of matter is a 4 fixed sign, so she's stable in nature. Yet this is at odds with the dynamic energy of the rest of her chart. She's born under an applying full moon. She's got moon trine Mars, Sun in a wide conjunction to Pluto. But there's the pragmatic, the Saturn. And can't see the rest of this. Anyway, and she's got Uranus conjunct her midheaven. Now, this is really important, which tells you that reality, she is used to her reality shifting and changing, and yet it's an irritant to her. It's got a really strong Saturn, even though it doesn't always look like it. And part of her irritation comes from that Moon-Mars trine as well. So her connection to the physical world, very strongly defined by Venus, her final dispositor, ruler of her IC and dignified. And also, if you like to play with fixed stars, it's conjunct Spica, which is the most fortunate fixed star. The rulers of her ascendant, Saturn and Uranus, have no connection to the sun, the ruler of her descendant. Now, the irony of this is someone who runs a boutique public relations agency. So it's easy to see that, you know, okay, hi everyone. Mercury retrograde did its thing and there was an interruption and it was my laptop. So I'm just going to reiterate what I was saying about Lillian's chart before we move on to the next sample chart. So again, her cross of matter is the 4 fixed signs. So she's stable in nature. Her world is stable in nature, but it's at odds with the dynamic energy of the rest of her chart. And I think, and I talked about the moon trine Mars, Uranus conjunct the midheaven, and how that tends to keep things sort of more up and down than you would expect with that fixed cross of matter. So, and her connection to the physical world is very strongly defined by Venus, which is her final dispositor, and it's the ruler of her IC, and it's dignified. So she has really strong people skills. She runs a PR agent, a boutique PR agency. And so her world is all about people, but she's got a strong practical nature and always gets the job done, which is the fixed nature of her cross of matter. However, the rulers of her ascendant, Saturn and Uranus, have no connection to the sun, the ruler of her descendant. So that tends to make it somewhat problematic. Now, for her, because sometimes she feels, as much as she is engaged and involved with people, that they actually don't see her. Karen, okay, so she's got a cross of matter that's fixed, mixed, I meant, fixed, mixed, they rhyme, cardinal and fixed. And so she's fluid, yet she's in search of stability. This is provided by the rulers of the ascendant, descendant trine each other, and the midheaven IC rulers sextile each other. So although the aspects are separating for the midheaven IC. So this indicates the qualities are already developed. So it's got a lot to call on. This is necessary for dealing with the moon, which is the ruler of the ascendant, opposed the sun, ruler of the IC, and Pluto in an out of sign conjunction to the IC. So there's always an internal shifting of her energy. That's Pluto conjunct that IC. And I mean, it may be intercepted, but it is still conjuncted and it's in Virgo. So there's a constant sense of well, I call Pluto and Virgo obsessive compulsive. So things tend to flow easily when she's working hard, but that has up to this stage of her life run her life a lot. And when Pluto did all its happy squares to all of her cardinal planets, she went through a major work shift, a major change in her work environment, and left because of health issues, and has now created a consultancy for herself, which if you look at her even, she was living off her ascendant descendant axis, which is looking for security, when the other one is looking for an opportunity to express itself in an individual way. And interestingly enough, along the way, she has now discovered how much she loves art and has started taking all kinds of lessons. Okay, I think this is our final example, and this is Thomas. His cross of matter is mutable. So he's adaptable and flexible. This is amplified by Mercury and Jupiter, also in mutable signs, but they're both dignified. So that changes the dynamic, because when we're looking at the first chart, which had a lot of mutability, the planets ruling the angles were not, had their challenges as well. So now they're not aspected, but they are dignified. And if you look at the rest of his chart, it's got a lot of dignified planets. So, and Jupiter, which is the handle on essentially what's a bucket, indicates someone constantly on the move. It's part of a grand water trine involving Uranus and Mars. And there's nothing predictable about the way his life unfolds. He remains for heaven's sakes, he remains grounded though, because he has Mercury conjunct Saturn in his 4th house. Now Mercury obviously is connected to 2 of the angles, and so that conjunction is a powerful statement about how he, because it's in the 4th house, how he calls upon his internal strength to deal with a life which is constantly in motion. Okay, it won't surprise you to discover that he's a pilot and an aeronautical engineer, and he does a lot of really interesting things in his life. Okay, so in conclusion, exploring a birth chart is always going to generate new approaches and new techniques and new perspectives. This is just one that acknowledges the value and importance of the framework for life provided by the cross of matter. One I use consistently with my clients. Of course, it doesn't supersede anything. Rather, it's meant to give further definition and a connection, and of course your life experience is going to bear out what that cross of matter says about you. It just gives, it isn't meant to replace anything, just add a layer of nuance or to give you a greater sense of how it is you can interact with your physical world and how that physical world impacts you. And what kind of relationship you have between, what the planets say about who you are internally and how that plays out in your physical world. And I always like to throw in a chuckle at the end. So I don't know. Well, today Aquarius might very well be a snow globe, because it's minus 24 centigrade where I live, with a wind chill that takes it to minus 36. So this is definitely the frozen north at this point in time. Okay, so and here's a shameless plug for my new podcast. I just did a thing on the Aquarius new moon. And I want to thank you for joining me or for watching this video on YouTube. And if you'd like to contact me, you can get in touch with me at aquariusstellium@outlook.com. My website is www.lesliefrancis.com. And my new podcast, if you didn't notice in the previous slide, is called coloring outside the box. So again, thank you so much. And I appreciate everybody's patience in dealing with technical issues, all of which were caused by my laptop, and I'm not taking responsibility for that in this 10 seconds. Okay, thank you so much, and please take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Lesley. Catch you next time.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.